Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 14th Philippine Linguistics Congress, or 14 PLC. It is an international occasional conference that focuses on current advances in the scientific study of language, which may be in the realm of theoretical or applied linguistics, as well as on the application of linguistic theory to the other fields of study done in the context of the Philippines. This conference is brought to you by the UP, the University of the Philippines Department of Linguistics, our primary aim being the study, preservation, and promotion of Philippine languages. The 14th PLC, as with past PLCs, provides a venue for researchers to share their studies on various linguistic phenomena and language issues here in our country, in the Philippines, and comparative studies between Philippine languages and other foreign languages to promote deeper understanding and explore possible implications for language learning, translation, and cross-cultural communication. Before we begin with this plenary session, I would like to call on or invite the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Professor Maria Bernadette L. Abrera.
It is an honor to welcome the speakers, guests, and participants to the 14th Philippine Linguistics Congress. During this historic period, when our global pandemic experience is paving the way for the explosion of language, to document the event, record the crisis, communicate the despair, confusion, as well as the hope that this event has brought upon us, and help the future generations understand how we sought to cope and survive this crisis. We only have to look at the terms we now use and hear regularly on an almost daily basis that define this historical occurrence: symptomatic, asymptomatic, contact tracing, essential services, vaxxed, unvaxxed, herd immunity, physical distancing, face mask, face shield, lockdown, bubble, isolation, quarantine, super spreader. In the academe, we have course packs, remote learning, online teaching, work from home, Zoom, and you are on mute. Then the new initials that we use without blinking: RT-PCR, PPE, ECQ, MECQ, GCQ, ICU, IATF, LSI, QR, APOR, non-APOR, NCR+. You have your own lists that capture and record both the tragedy, the exasperation, the confusion, and even the fun which we are all going through locally, nationally, and globally. We see in this encapsulated sample how language, and significantly its study, provides us an insight into the human historical experience, human knowledge and behavior that we wish to understand. The papers that you will find here will be a record of this human experience that we hope to deepen our awareness of ourselves. This Congress has an outstanding keynote speaker, Dr. David Zorc, who is known for his research in Austronesian and particularly Philippine linguistics. Congratulations to the convener, Professor Jem Javier, Chair of the Department of Linguistics, and to the dynamic faculty and staff of the department who worked untiringly for this Congress. I am confident that you will have a very productive exchange in these 4 days. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Dean Abrera. At this point, I would like to say that I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our plenary speaker. Our David Zorc has been blessed with over 40 years of experience in comparative historical linguistics, lexicography, language teaching, language analysis, curriculum development, and applied linguistics. He has conducted research on 80 languages of the Philippines, Aboriginal Australia, Armenia, and Africa, encompassing the Austronesian, Bantu, Cushitic, Indo European, and Pama-Nyungan language families. His publication of 31 books on 24 languages, 40 journal articles, and 30 presentations at international conferences solidifies his reputation as one of the world's leading authorities on the less commonly taught languages, especially of our country, the Philippines. He has produced 6 dictionaries: Akyanon, Eastern Armenian, Somali, Tagalog slang, Filipino etymological, and Yolngu Mata. He was awarded the Brother Andrew Gonzalez FSC Distinguished Professorial Chair in Linguistics and Language Education by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines in February 26, 2005. So without further ado, I now give the floor to Dr. David Zorc. Lolo David.
Good evening, everybody in the Philippines, and good morning for those here in the US. I'd like to start out by explaining that the title of the paper that I'm presenting had one modest change. It was originally Axis Relationships in the Philippines when traditional subgrouping fails. I was not doing a crowd catcher. That was what I thought at the time. But somebody pointed out to me, Dr. Blust, that since I believe in the standard subgrouping that most scholars have put forward, subgrouping does not fail, it just falls short. Axis relationships are a completely different animal from etymologies. An axis is any unique form not found anywhere else, therefore it's an innovation, but it spreads across two or more well-established subgroups. So that is what an axis is, and I'm going to invite the audience, anyone interested, in seeing if they can come up with a better definition of axis, because I'm not always that well inspired. Going on now, the other thing about an axis etymon is it's not a normal etymology. Those go up from low-level proto-languages like Proto-Visayan or Proto-Central Philippine, all the way up to Proto-Austronesian. Those are the ones that Dr. Blust mainly has in his uh, comparative Austronesian dictionary. I also talked about in a paper some time ago about selective innovations. Selective innovations are those like the word dagun for the word year, which replaces takon, which is a solid Austronesian etymology. It comes up in a wide spread of languages, but from the north of the Philippines all the way through the south. And yet, so in a sense, it competes with the word taon. At any rate, the other type of thing is a microgroup. A microgroup is a small group of languages that go together. For example, Blust talk about Greater Central Philippine. This includes the Tagalog, Visayan, Bicol, Mansakan, Subanon, Manobo, Palawanic languages. So that's a large macro group of languages, and that's not an axis either. So we have to weigh all these different situations to determine what is an axis. Now, how did I come upon this? When I was writing my dissertation back in 1972, I began to see that there were some forms that did not match any of the subgroups that I was trying to establish. One of them is the word bakal, which is spread throughout Bicol, the Western Visayas, and yes, Central, North Visayan. That we don't have Bakal, I think, on the list here. It's in Bululacanon, Aclanon, It goes through central Visayan languages and then all the way up into Bicol. This is the word for by. We know for a fact that the Austronesian word for by was bali. Tagalog has a cognate, of course, in bili, bilhan, bilhin. Uh, so this word bakal is spread only in the North Visayan area, which we have a map of that, I believe, that shows, let's see, do we have the map available? There we are. I've got it on my. It starts with the southern end of Mindoro and goes all the way across to Catanduanes in the north, and then from Aklan across Masbate, Tika, and there we are. That's the map. Thank you. And Sorsogon. So this is an axis. And now we did have some words that we flashed by earlier, like Be'ul. This Aklanon has Bu'ol. Asi language or Junganon has let's see, they say ba'ol. It's an unexplained shift. Normally, when two schwas come together, they should give two u's or o sounds. It should have been bo'ol, bo'oy. I'm sorry, in Ojunganon, but it or asi, but came out as ba'ol. There's a similar phenomenon in Bisayan. They say bu'it for kind or good, and in Tagalog it's mabait. So we have the same case there where in Tagalog mabait, it probably comes from bu'it with a shift in the first vowel to an A, but to the second to the regular expected reflexive schwa in Tagalog, which is I. There's another form now. Hambal is the word for say or speak. That's sabi in Tagalog, or salita, but usually sabi. Austronesian has the word Proto-Austronesian kari, K-A-R-I, but in Kinaraya, Pandan, Bulalakaw, Masbate, and Hiligaynon, it's hambal. In Semirara and Cagayanan, it's ambal. In Aklanon, it's hambay. And in Asi and Romblonon, it's hambay. So again, these cut across a North Visayan axis and are not found anywhere else in the Philippines. The word mayad, for good, replaces Proto-Malayo-Polynesian pia and Proto-Philippine upia. In Aklanon, Pandan, Kinaraya, Bulalakanon, Datagnon, Cuyonon, Viracnon, Southern Sorsogon, and Central Sorsogon, it's Mayad. In Cagayanon, Manobo, which is a Manobo language that's been influenced by South Visayan before it left Mindanao, and then by West Visayan, they assimilated the first syllable to the Y, and it's Miyad. So Mayad is again, a North Visayan. Another solid etymology for the North Visayan area is ta'o, or ta'u, to give, which replaces Austronesian bagay, which has a cognate, of course, in Tagalog, bigay. Kinaraya and Panduan have ta'u, whereas Aklanon, Bulalakaonon, Semirara, Romblonon, Asi, Northern Bicol, and Southern Bicol have ta'o. Another important word is buhin, subtract or deduct. It replaces Proto-Philippine bawas. We have Aklanon, Kinaraya, Pandan, Bulalakaonon, Asi, and Hiligaynon, buhin. Semirara, buin. Cuyonon, buin. And Cagayanon again has borrowed it as buin. Now, this is an interesting word because so far the ACD of Dr. Bluss does not have a word that means subtract or deduct. He does have another word that means reduce in price, but I believe that is related primarily to once monetary uh, conduct got into the Philippines. So to lower the price of something involves money, and I'm sure that was not an early Austronesian thing. So subtract is possibly one of the words that we need to aim for at the Proto-Austronesian level. Okay, the next axis that I discovered was the Southern Luzon axis. This includes Tagalog, Remontado, Hatangkai, Kasiguran Dumagat, Acta, Bulalakanon, Bicol, and Hanunoo. There's a map that shows this axis, again, pretty widespread in that area of the Philippines. Possibly not all of the left side of Mindoro needs to be included, but otherwise that map is an accurate reflection of the area where this word is distributed. The word bata, stench or bad odor, replaces a word all of you will know, baho. Baho, of course, is in Tagalog and many other Philippine languages, but Sambal, Central Sorsogon, Naga, Legazpi, Miraya Bicol, Libon, Rinconada, and Buhi have bata. And Western Albay Bicol has assimilated both of those, or not assimilated, but changed them to butta using schwa. That's a shift that does happen in some of the southern Bicol languages. And that, replacing a word as important as Proto-Malay-Polynesian baho. Another really good word is the word for carabao. Now, most Filipinos are familiar with the word kalabaw in Tagalog, which comes from Malay kerbau, but that word is actually, according to Mahdi, from Mon Khmer. So it's what he called a maverick reconstruction, Carabao. However, Proto-Austronesian had something like Kanwang. Aklanon is one of the few southern Philippine languages that retains Anwang, and a lot of times Aklanons get laughed at for saying Anwang instead of Carabao, but it's very common in the northern Philippines, even with its form Nuang, primarily more than Anwang or Inwang, which are replacements for it. But Kapampangan, Bolinao, Sambal, and Naga Bicol have Damulag. Botolan has Damuag. Miraya, West Albay Bicol, Libon, Rinconada, and Buhi have Damulag. They have lost accent retention, so instead of Damulag, the accent falls on the final syllable, Damulag. But that is an important replacement. Another Tagalog word that is widespread, and everyone knows this, is alikabok. That replaces Proto-Malayo-Polynesian gabok, Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian kabug or abug. Kapapangan, Botolan, Aita, and Mag-Indi, some Aita and Central Dumagat Acta have alikabok, and Tagalog and Bulalakanon have alikabok with an O. Another important word in the southern Luzon axis is dikut for grass. There's a Proto-Austronesian had the word udu, Proto-Malayo-Polynesian had zukot or dukot. In Kapampangan, Botolan, and Sambal, it's dikot. In Libon and West Albay Bicol, it's rikot. In those languages, the D, initial D, is changed to R. Finally, there's the word for egg, which is Southern Luzon axis salag. It replaces ityalug for Proto-Austronesian. Miraya, Libon, West Albay Bicol have salag, but Bolinao and Sambal have the reflexive capital R, salay. So the word for egg has changed from Austronesian through to the Southern Luzon axis. Our next access is Eastern Mindanao. This includes South Visayan, Mamanwa, Mansakan, Danau, Subanan, and various dialects of Manobo. It's normally located in the eastern area of Mindanao, except Subanon, which has moved to the west wing of Mindanao. Map there shows this. We didn't include in this map the Subanon area because it's pretty clear that the Subanons moved off to the west. So it does cover most of eastern Luzon. Mindanao. It was this axis that led Andy Gallman in his 1997 dissertation to propose a Proto-East Mindanao. Andy and I disagreed with each other. I thought that we had in that area a South Visayan, a Mansakan, and some other groups. And I since discovered that, my goodness, this is an axis that includes those languages. So Gallman was well intentioned in proposing what he did as Proto-East Mindanao, but I believe that to have been an axis. And of course, no one knew about axes in those days. One of the words, again, is a word for good. We remember we had Mayad for the North Visayan axis. This East Mindanao axis has Dayao, which actually comes from Dayao, a Proto-Philippine word for praise. So it's a semantic extension. It replaces, again, Proto-Malayo-Polynesian Pia or Mapia and Proto-Philippine Upia. But in Kamayo, Boso, Tandaganon, it's Madayao. In Mansakan, it has a phonemically short penult, Dayao. In Mamanwa, it's Madazao. In Kalagan, Tagakaolo, Caraga, Kabasagan, Mandaya, and Isamal, it has syncope with Madjao. So another solid candidate. The next one is Sidan, they. Now this is exactly like Proto-Malayo-Polynesian Sida. However, it has an N at the end. No justification for the N. No reason that we can think of, maybe analogy with the na marker of attributive marker, which is nga or na in other Philippine languages, but we don't know that for a fact. At any rate, Kamayo has siran, Mamanwa and Maranao have siran, Mansaka, Isamal, Boso, Kabasagan, Mandaya, Calagan, and Maguindanao have silan, and Subanon loses the S but has ilan. So they keep this final N. A third one is the word for day, which, if you see there, the Proto-Philippine reconstruction is something like Kalgao, K-Q-A-L. It has an initial Q, not a glottal stop, and the phoneme J, which is distinguished in the North by a G reflex rather than a D. At any rate, many Philippine languages have aldao or algao. So the L has been replaced by a nasal. We've gotten here a nasal cluster, which Dempwolf had called the facultative nasal. In Western Bukidnon and Ilianon Manobo, it's Andu. In another dialect of Ilianon, it's Undu. In Central Subanon, it's Gundao. In Western Subanon, it's Gondao. And in Maranao, it's Dondao. So this replacement of the L with an N is an exciting kind of development because this word has carried over into other Austronesian languages. There are others too, like the word haldik, to be afraid of something, has become andik or handik in these Eastern Mindanao area. So at any rate, that nasal cluster introduction for what was an LC cluster is important. Another important replacement is the Austronesian word guanay, or Proto-Malayo-Polynesian laki or lalaki, for man or male. In the eastern Mindanao axis, it's Isug. Mansaka, Boso, Kabasagan, and Badaya have Isug. Butuan, Kamayo, Caraga have Usog, and Kalagan, Isamal, and Tagakaolo have Isug, but it also means husband. So they've replaced these very important and common Austronesian words for male with this particular axis word. Another one that gets replaced is Proto-Western Malay-Polynesian Kudipan for slave. That's Alipin in Tagalog, which is itself a borrowing from Northern Philippine languages, who have also replaced the U with an A. So from Udipan, you get Ulipin, and Tagalog has Alipin. But at any rate, in Eastern Mindanao axis, it's Allang with a geminate L. And Mansaka, Mandaya, Kabasagan, Boso, Tagakaolo, Kalagan, Dibabawan, and Sarangani, Manobo reflect Alang. So again, a very old word has been replaced in this axis. We now move on to the northern Luzon axis, which includes Ilocano, the Cagayan Valley, the Central Cordilleran, and the Bashiec languages. The map shows this one very accurately, although some of these languages may not have all been located where they are now. The first word we're taking up on this is the word for hair lip, which is gusing. It replaces Proto-Philippine bungi. Ilocano, Ibanag, Gadang, Yogad, Malawig, Itneg, Manabo, Luba, and Northern Kankanay have gusing. Kankanay South has gusing, and Balangao has guhang. So the word for hair lip is the first. Another important one is the word kimat for eyelashes. Sometimes it can mean eyebrow. That mixture they've been mixed up a bit. We have Western Malayo-Polynesian kizup, or Proto-Philippine, Proto-Southern Philippine, pidik. At any rate, Isneg, Gadang, Malawig, Kalinga, Luba have kimat. That data comes from McFarland's Northern Philippine Geography. Ata has kima. Central Cagayan Ata has kima. The glottal stop is unexplained. And Gadang has kimet, which comes from reed. Another word that describes the northern Luzon axis is ayat, which is love. There's no established edema for love. However, if anyone remembers from my dissertation, the Visayan languages as a whole have innovated the word gugma, which is very Visayan in nature. So the word love has been replaced in the Philippines, but although Visayan is a Proto-Visayan or Pan-Visayan thing with gugma, this word, ayat, is primarily a northern Luzon axis word, and you can see what languages it's contained in there. Another one replacing Proto-Malayo-Polynesian ding-ding or dingyan, which is a Malay word, or Proto-Southern Philippine ramig, is the word lumin for cold. Present in Pamplona, Ibanag, Ata, in Tuguegarao, Ibanag, Malawig, and Itawis, Manabo, and Isneg. Isneg is nalman with syncope. The word for cockfight often varies around the Philippines. It's possible that all of them have been under influence from Malay sabong, which got borrowed by Tagalog, but Dr. Blust reconstructs it as Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian sabong, but this pilut, I reconstruct it with a short schwa because the L tends to get geminated. So anytime there's gemination, I reconstruct a phonemically short vowel with the symbol above it. Yogad has Palut, Gadang has Mapalut, Ibanag Pamplona has Pello, and Ilocano, Northern and Southern Kankanai have Palut. So whatever, whether they're borrowings or inherited words, the word for cockfight differs from most other Philippine languages. Then we move on to the central Cordilleran axis, which involves central Cordilleran languages, South Cordilleran, Sambalic, Kapampangan, and Tagalog. There's the map of that area. And the first word in this axis that we're going to discuss is pukal. Pukal, bone. It replaces the Austronesian word, something like chukalan, or Proto-Malayo-Polynesian tu'elan, Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian tu'elang. Kiangan has pukol, Amganad Ifugao has pu'ol, Batad has pu'al, Paininan has pu'ol, Balangao has po'al, and Bontok has pakul. Pokal, sorry, I mispronounced that. And Kankanai, it moves on to the meaning shoulder there with their pakul, Ibaloy pukal, Kayapa pukal, Pangasinan pukel, and Kalei, Kalahan pukel means knee, and Central Dumagat Akta pukel means thighs. So you get these bouncing body parts, as I sometimes like to refer them jokingly. Something from bone can be moved to a specific part like shoulder, knee, or thigh. Another important word is the word tagtag, run, apparent only in the central Luzon axis. There's no actual replacement form that we can establish because Proto-Austronesian lagiu had the semantics of run away, to flee. So it's not really a generic word for run. So we don't know what the word for run was earlier than Proto-Philippine. But at any rate, we've got the Isneg, Tagtag, Managtag, Bontok, Itneg, Isinay, Tagtag, Itneg, Luba, Southern Kankanay, Managtag, Amganad and Batad, Ifugao, Tumagtag, and Northern Kankanay, Muntagtag. Also, Ilocano has a related word, Tagtag, to walk with jerky or heavy gait, that I found in Carl Rubino's dictionary. Yet another Central Luzon axis form is agan, hungry. It replaces Proto-Malayo-Polynesian bitil, Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian bitin, and Proto-Southern Philippine gutom, which is the root of Tagalog gutom, of course, or the etymology for gutom. Amganad Ifugao has maagan, Patat has agangan, Baininan has inagan, and Kiangan has naagangan. These come from McFarland. And then Kayapa has agang, Ibuloy naagang, and Kankanay dagaang with metathesis and a prefix. And then Tagalog balat is a borrowing from the Central Luzon axis, but the form is actually pronounced bilat for skin. It replaces Proto-Malayo-Polynesian kulit. We have Kayapa bilat, Kalei-Ikalahan belat, Inibaloy bildat, Kiangan balat, and Kampampangan balat, which was borrowed then by Tagalog. And lastly, another word for run, which is batik, just in the Central Luzon axis. Same things apply. It's not really in competition with lagiu because that meant run away. We've got Ibaloy man batik, Pangasinan on batik, Kayapa batik, Kalei-Ikalahan betik, and Amganan Kiangan Ifuga bumtik with syncope. And on to another axis, Palawan Kalamianic. All right, this involves the Palawan subgroup and the Kalamianic languages. That's spoken in Palawan and the various islands you can see on the map there that are north of Palawan. The first word is something like kadung, to sit. It's got a Q and a glottal stop in it, so that's a curious one for those who don't believe in glottal stop. Aborlan has Akdung, Batak, uh, Taot Bato, Quezon, and Molbog have Adung. Palawan has Arong for nose, and Calamian has Karong for a pointed nose. That's where we get the evidence for the initial Q, whereas Aborlan gives us the glottal cluster in the middle. Another one is the replacement of Proto-Maleo-Polynesian Bakun, which is the negative for it's not so, he is not rich or something, or he is not a farmer. You would say Bukon. Tagalog, of course, has lost that and says Hindi, but a lot of Philippine languages do have either Bukon, Bukon, Bakon, whatever. The word is belag in the Palawan Calamianic languages. You've got Agutainon, Karamianan, Palawano, and Molbog belag, and Aborlan belag, but it means different rather than not so. Then the axis also has the word luwak for plant or dibble. Calamian, Agutainon, Karamianan, Batak, Aborlan, and Palawano have luwak. So nothing special in there. We can't predict where the accent was, except most likely on the penult. None of them are accent-preserving languages. The next word is one that might have come from two monosyllables joined together, because Dr. Blust reconstructs a Proto-Western Malay-Polynesian dul, but this is dul. There is also in the Philippines some evidence for a dul, meaning thunder, but this is dul dug. So every now and then I've found that you can get two monosyllabic roots joined together. One common one is ruk sak, which comes from a ruk and a sak. But if that's the case, then that's the case. But Calamian and Agutainon have dul, which is perfect for the final cap R. But Aborlan, Batak, and Palawano have dul dug. So that's why I separate this one with a separate reconstruction just for this axis. As you can see from the Austronesian and Malayo-Polynesian forms, they're very different from this. And then the word for harvest, which is clearly ani in Tagalog, which comes from a Proto-Austronesian form, kanish, Proto-Malayo-Polynesian gani, and Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian agani. It's kayag in Palawan Calamianic axis. Aborlan has kayag. Batak has kayid. That is irregular. It should be a G, but it has a D. That's why the asterisk is there. But it must be cognate. It's probably just an assimilation of the G to the palatalness of the Y. Palawano is kaig, and Calamian Agutanon is ayig. So Calamian Agutanon lose the K regularly. So it didn't become a glottal stop. It was lost, but phonotactically, you get a glottal step at the beginning of a word. Our next axis moves a bit further. It's the Palawan-Mindoro axis. This time it involves North Mangyan, South Mangyan, Calamianic, and Palawanic. And the map shows that area extending now from Palawan and the northern islands of Palawan to Mindoro. This is an interesting word. The word for long or tall is habuat. Okay, it replaces 3 or 4 different words that Dr. Blust has proposed. The reason none of these languages preserve H, but I have long realized that there is a ha adjective of measure prefix apparent in the Philippines. Cebuano, Waray, and Bicol preserve these. It's also found semi-preserved in Itbayatan, which preserves H's. Sometimes it's lost in Itbayatan and sometimes it's preserved. But at any rate, this ha prefix goes on words that show any kind of measure: long, far, near, short, tall, etc. And so I proposed that it had an H, which got lost, unfortunately, in all the languages for which there's any evidence. Batak has abuat, Aborlan has abuatay, Palawan has mabwat, Kalamian and Karamianan have abuat, Agutainon has mabwat, long, and it means long. There's also Iraya Tajawan on Mindoro, Abuat, Alangan, Maabuat, Buhid, Abuat, and Hanono, which unfortunately also loses H on this one, Abuat meaning tall. There's a deictic T, which means yawn. Now, Blust reconstructs T, and of course, everyone knows Ilocano iti, which is a case marking particle there. So T has a long precedent, but the thing is, it seems to have been a close deictic in the earlier proto languages, and it's moved to a distant one. So instead of being deictic first position, it's deictic third position root. Yon, yonder at a distance, okay? So I'm proposing that this change in distance from near to far has been done in common with Aborlan, Batak, and Palawano iti, Kalaminan atii, Agutainon asii, Hanunoo ati, Tida, and Siti, Buhid, Tia, and Alangan Tajawan ati. The word for body also gets innovated a lot in the Philippines. Everyone knows about katawan, which is probably related to ka, tao, and what makes you a person is your body. At any rate, this is normally a word that means whole or entire, bilog, but the word bilog has come to mean body in this Palawan Mindoro axis. Batak, Aborlan, and Palawan, it's bilog. In Hanunoo, it's bilog. In Buhid, it's habilogan. In Tajawan, it's bilogan. And in Alangan, it's bilugan. So that innovation to the word for body. Then the word for lie or deceive, we cannot reconstruct a really early form. That differs. It's one of the most, it has more isoglosses than almost any other word in the McFarland Northern Philippines study, to lie or deceive. So it really is a wild word in the Philippines. But the word busli for lie or deceive is limited to bukli in Kalamianan, where I propose that the S dissimilated to K. Agutainon and Karamianan has tutli, Iraya has buslian, and Alangan has buslion. So this word for lie or deceive is unique to that area amongst many unique words in the Philippines for lie or deceive. The word for rat is in this axis is angbe, okay, with a full velar nasal. You'll see that in the North Visayan axis, that velar nasal has assimilated. So in North Visayan, it's ambe, but in the Palawan Mindoro axis, it remains angbe. For these languages, it's Aborlan and Batak, angbe, Hanunoo angbu. The glottal stop is an alternate. It's either angbu or angbu, and buhi lost the glottal stop with angbo. Then we move on to a southern Mindanao axis, which includes south. These are new terms, perhaps, to some of you. The languages Taboli, Coronadal, and Sarangani Bilaan, and Tiduray, which some have called Bilik, which really should apply only to the Balaan languages, I now call southwestern Mindanao, which then is distinguished from southeastern Mindanao, which is Bagobo Klata, a language that had long been ignored by me and many other linguists, but is now being studied in great detail by Edward Estrella of UP. At any rate, southwestern Mindanao, southeastern Mindanao, and then the greater central Philippine subgroup. By the way, on that one, Matt Charles and I used to call something like that Meso-Philippine. It wasn't as thorough and comprehensive as Dr. Bluss' renaming of it as the Greater Central Philippine Group, but at any rate, it was once upon a time called Meso-Philippine. If you ever see that term, you'll know its context. And the map shows this here where it's distributed. And here's the word Abbas, measles. It's found in Tiroray, in Taboli, Abbas. In Maranao, it's the word for chickenpox. And there's only these three witnesses. But at any rate, I'm proposing that the reason that these words are shared in this particular area is that it's part of a southern Mindanao axis. Another word that has many, many cognates throughout the Philippines, or different cognates, is the word for an unripe coconut. It's agit in the South Mindanao axis with Iranon, Maguindanao, and Taboli agit, Coronadao, Bilaan ogit, and Iligan Manobo ahit, where the G changes to an H. The word for tomorrow is also quite frequently differentiated in the Philippines, but it's just the South Mindanao axis that has amag with the capital R. In Maranao, it's amag. In Tiruray, we have namag with this, unfortunately, the stereotyped Philippine G, but Calamian Tagbanwa has andamal, and Batak has indamar, which is an irregular reflex for that language, but seems to indicate that it came from this cap R. So this is very iffy, but it's a proposal. And then a word for a species of banana. Now, this is really out on a limb because there's many words for banana itself as a generic term, but the species proliferate. There's probably 30 reconstructions available. However, this particular one, Amas, so far can only be found in Taboli, Tiruray, and Western Bukidnon, Manobo. So I'm putting it forth as a potential axis. And then the word bakagwang for back, meaning the back of one's body. You have Kalagan, bakagwang, Kamayo, bakagwang, Dibabawan, bakagwang, and Taboli with loss of the whole first part of the word kwang. And notice that that Dibabawan means spine and Kamayo means hips. So what it really meant, we're not 100% sure either. So again, out on the limb. The central Mindanao axis is our next one. That involves Mansakan, Danao, Subanon, and Manobo. What's important to note is it did not cross over into the other members of the Greater Central Philippine Group. It's not in Bisayan, Bicol, or Tagalog. So just these four members of Greater Central Philippine. The map shows this one, although all of Mindanao is highlighted here. That's because that's where these languages are located. But I think historically it was more limited to just the central part of Mindanao. If you remember earlier, I talked about the word for pestle, day, andeo. This is another one of these words with a nasal cluster. The word is reconstructed as Proto-Austronesian ashlu, or Proto-Northern Philippine kahlu, or Proto-Southern Philippine haklu. The L, the glottal stop, either Q or QL cluster has assimilated or dissimilated into a nasal cluster again. So Ata, Tigwa, Ilianon, and Western Bukidnon Manobo have Andu, and Maranao and Maguindanao just have Undu, shortening. So this word for pestle is amongst four different words where the central, where on Mindanao, a nasal cluster has replaced a probably L cluster. Another interesting word in the central Mindanao is balau, story, talk, or tell. Boso Mandaya has a longer affixed form, affixed form babalawin. Caraga has balau. Isamal has bao, where they've lost the L. Mansaka has balau, speak or talk. Dibabawan, again losing the L and joining the ow into a U, that means converse. Sarangani Manobo has balau, discussion, or balau balau, reduplicated, to talk with each other. The word buntod, mountain, replaces two Proto-Austronesian words, bukid, which everyone knows as bukid in Tagalog, although it doesn't mean mountain, it means a farm in Tagalog. But bukid, which has many cognates throughout northern and southern Philippines, and bulid, which is bulod in some Philippine languages. This has gotten a shape buntod. Western Bukidnon, Manobo, and Calagan have buntod. Sarangani, Manobo, and Western Subano have bontod, and Central Subanon has buntod. So again, a candidate for a central Mindanao axis. The words for wipe, punas, and pahed, very well known throughout the Philippines thanks to Tagalog, has become galis. Calagan and Sarangani Manobo have galis, and Mansaka has garis, where L regularly goes to R. A word for spider, tapayan, replaces panlawa and Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian kawa. Just Dibabawan and Calagan have this, but because they're different subgroups, it qualifies to be a potential axis form. Then we have a huge Visayan Bicol axis. This means all the Visayan and Bicol languages. Now, the reason I decided that this is an axis is that Proto-Central Philippine is clearly well established. It was part of my dissertation that included Tagalog, Bicol, and Visayan and Mansakan. So those four groups. But there are many forms, there are some forms, that where Visayan and Bicol alone share just one etymon. For example, the word kalayu coming up in fire. This is very widely distributed from Kinaraya, Pandan, Bulalacaunon, Semirara, Romblon, Masbate, Central Sorsogon, Waray, Naga Bicol, and Rinconada Kalayu. Aklanon is Kalayu. And why do I reconstruct a final zero here? Because in Aklanon, to set fire to something is Kalayui. So when Aklanon substitutes a semivowel for a vowel, that's usually a surefire way of just knowing that there's a morphophonemic final zero there. So that's why I do put the zero here. I don't reconstruct it often, but there are some words where a final zero. Asi languages have kayadu, where they change L to Y and Y to D. Cebuano, Butuano, and Tausug have kayu with a long vowel where they've lost the L. And Surigao has kayaju, where the L goes to Y, but the Y goes to J. And Northern Catanduanes has karayu, where the L goes to R. So this is an extremely widespread word. Otherwise, what we wind up with is something called Bisako, which is an area that just involves the three main Visayan language spoken in the Bicol area of the Philippines, and that's what McFarland called Gubat, Sorsogon, and Masbate, which have different names now, northern or central and southern Sorsogon and Masbateño. At any rate, the word halnas is slippery. In Naga, it's Mahalnas. In Legazpi, Miraya, Western Albay, Bicol, Libon, and Rinconada, it's Maalnas with loss of H. In Verac, it's Mahanglas, where the we get a metathesis and a full velar nasal instead of the assimilated nasal. In northern Catanduanes, it's Mahanlas. In Buhi, which loses H, and has a R, it's Maagnas. In southern Sorsogon, it's Mahanlas. So this word for slippery is definitely a Bisayan Bicol or Bisako word. Same for Hali, which I have an interesting thing there. Why does the reconstruction have an accented A, but then a circumflex above the I? What it is there are accent pairs like tapos and tapus in Tagalog. That's either the verb root finish, or when something is finished, you put the accent on the final syllable. When I see words that are verbs, like this one, hali, to leave or go away, hali would mean gone away, I think. So the difference in accent can be accounted for by morphological differences, whether you have the verb root or a stative counterpart, which would then have accent on the final syllable. So whenever you see a circumflex on a final vowel, it means that might be the alternate accent pattern for languages that have adopted the stative form rather than the root form. At any rate, there's Naga, Central Sorsogon, and Southern Sorsogon Hali, Legazpi Ali, which regularly loses H, Virac and Northern Catanduanes Hari, where the L goes to R, West Albay Bicol Ali, losing the H, and Masbate Hali. Now, see, Masbate has this stative kind of accent, so that's why I do that. Another word, remember we had alikabok earlier for a different axis. Here's alpug, dust, replacing the same words in Malayo-Polynesian and Western. Naga, Legazpi, Miraya, West Albay, Bicol, and Buhi have alpug, and Masbate and Sorsogon, following the Bisayan accent pattern, put this accent on the first syllable, alpug. The word for fed up with is uyam. In Legazpi, Miraya, Central Sorsogon, and Southern Sorsogon, the accent is uyam. In West Albay, Bicol, Rinconada, and Buhi, which lose penult accent, it's uyam. And now we move to Catanduanes. This is an axis I only discovered about 2 months ago when I was working through a word list that I had, a mimeograph word list that Kurt McFarland distributed to Professor Diane's students and staff at Yale University. Since I was there working for Professor Diane at the time, he gave me a copy. I only collated it starting about 4 months ago. At any rate, Northern Catanduanes, which is the Pandan dialect, not Viracnon, that's an error there. It should be Pandan. And Northern Bicol, which is the Virac dialect, agree because they're both on an island. And that's what an island makes the perfect access situation. And you can see from the map there, Pandan on the north, Virac on the south, but there's tons of towns in between. But they do break up between the Pandan-like version and the Virac-like version. At any rate, if we look at the first word, tingu, for tooth. Now we know, the word Nipan is a Proto-Austronesian word and is very well represented throughout the Philippines. But here we have a replacement of that, and that's got to count for something. And it so happens that the word tingu is only found on Catanduanes Island and in Pandan and Virac, or Northern Catanduanes and Virac. Another really important word, uli, to go home, uwi in Tagalog, is be replaced by paribud. And you, again, only on Catanduanes, only Northern Catanduanes and Virac have paribud. There are several words reconstructed for dull, meaning not sharp. We've got Proto-Malayo-Polynesian tumpul and dumpul, Western Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian ngazul. But here we have mangunor, dull, not sharp. Northern Catanduanes, mangunor, with the R generally from L. And Virac has mangunor, with the L being its particular reflex. So since we have the final consonant being Northern Catanduanes R, and Virac the U for the L, this is really a solid candidate for something that just originated on Catanduanes Island. Again, here we are with another word for dust, but this time it's tapug. Again, replacing the same Austronesian words. Northern Catanduanes and Virac have tapug, identical, but again, it's a pretty solid replacement. So I think that we have a solid case for Catanduanes axis. And lastly, there's hiwas, to move. There's no established etymon for this, but again, as far as I know, this word hiwas is only found in the Philippines in northern Catanduanes and Virac. And there was one more I threw in, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Abanaban, I think, Abanaban, later today. There's no established etymon, but again, this word is limited to just northern Catanduanes and Virac. And finally, we move to the Western Luzon axis, which covers Bashic, Ilocano, or the Ilocan subgroup, Central Cordilleran, Southern Cordilleran, and Central Luzon languages. The map, again, is an accurate depiction of where the languages are spoken now and probably close to where they were spoken originally. The first word is a word that can be found beyond the Philippines, but not in the meaning assigned. All right. In the Western Luzon axis, the word bulong means leaf. It replaces Proto-Malayo-Polynesian dahon. Okay. It's found in Ilocano, Ibaloy, Cayapa, Pangasinan, Sambal, Bolinao, Botolan, and Kapapangan, bulong. In Ilongot, buong. In Itbayatan, vugong. And in Ivatan, vuhong. Okay. There you can see that where I got it from in McFarland and Reed. The word bulong is used for medicine throughout the Visayas. So that is the etymon bulong has a much wider distribution, but it means either leaf or medicine. And Blust has called it a medicinal plant in Malayo-Polynesian, I believe. But the meaning leaf has replaced dahon. So to me, that replacement by this form is important. The word for bedbug does not have much of a precedent. We can't establish. But again, kitab, we have Ilocano, kitab, Ilocano kitab, luba itneg kankana iboloy kitab, Isinay itab, and Manabo Ifugao Kitob, okay, from McFarland. This word for bedbug is just limited to these languages so far. There are obviously other words in McFarland for it, which are different etymologies, but not necessarily different axes. But this one struck me as an axis form. The word for cat cannot necessarily be reconstructed. Dr. Blust notes that there's no evidence that the domestic cat was an Austronesian phenomenon. So we're out on a limb here. But it's interesting because you get things like pusa, kusa, and different etymologies for cat that seem to be legitimate etymologies. At any rate, we get Ilocano and Southern Kankanay Pusa. We get Kiangan Ifugao Puha, Botolan Puha, Bolinao Sambal Kapapangan and Tagalog Pusa, and Pangasinan Pusa. Everyone may know that I wrote a paper that shows that Pangasinan lost phonemic vowel length that was attributed to Proto-Philippine, and that's why they're the only language to put accent on the final syllable in this word. The next word, excuse me, is the word for ant, which is something like kuton. We get Ilocano isneg luba itneg kankanay kuton, Ibaloy kuton, and Malaweg keton. I'm not. If I'm massacring these pronunciations, forgive me. At any rate, no other Philippine language seems to have a cognate of these words. Another one where we probably can't establish an early etymology is the word for sibling. It's interesting that we can reconstruct etymologies for younger sibling and even older sibling, but a generic word for sibling can't be reconstructed. At any rate, this word basat within the Western Luzon axis, we have Ilocano with a syncope form kabsat, luba, and itneg, Bisat, Manabo, Basat, Kalinga from Reed, Bosat, and Bolinao, Busat. All right, that comes from either McFarland or Reed data. That word for sibling is just not found anywhere else in the Philippines. Now on to the north central Luzon axis, which covers the Cagayan Valley and Central Cordilleran. And we have a map of that reflects the current distribution of these languages, which may be close to the historic distribution. Everyone in the Philippines knows sing-sing from Tagalog for ring, but in the north central Luzon axis, it's something like sakkalang, sakkalang. In central Cagayan Agta, it's sakkalang. In Ata, it's sakalang, sakakang. In Pamplona, Ibanag, it's sakkalang, along with Kalinga. With Tugarao, Ibanag, it's saklang, and with Itawis, it's saklang. So we have an innovated word for ring that seems to be a part of an axis. Oh, I see. There was, more words, Malawig and Yogad, Gadang, Kiang, and Amganag, Ifugao. So it's widely distributed in these languages, but unique. So hopefully another axis. The next one is just a simple case of metathesis of the original Austronesian word for earthquake, which was something like linog. It's lindol in Tagalog, but in many other Philippine languages, it's linog in the languages where capital R went to G. It's lunig, though, or lunig in the central Luzon axis. You get Kalinga, Malawig, Itawis, Balangao, and Tugarao, Ibunag, lunig. We get Central Cordillera, Acta lunig, Ata lunig, Gadang a lunig, and Pamplona, Ibanag, and Yogad lunig with accent on the final. So that's just a simple case. We're back to cat again. Here's a different word, but again, its distribution suggests an axis relationship. And even if it's a borrowing, I do not believe the being a borrowing, because they borrowed in common, it means it's shared in common and therefore could be a genuine axis, because that's the whole point of an axis, is these languages have been sharing for several hundred years, up to 1,000 years. So at any rate, instead of pusa, we now have a K, kusa, and at any rate, I propose that this is a separate axis form. In north central Luzon axis, the word for reed is bid, not the widespread Malay borrowing of basa. It's found in Malawig, mbid, Itawis, Gadang, and Yogad, in Kiangan, Ifugao, and in Ibanag. Now, Proto-Bicol has the word midbid, which probably is somehow related, but it means know someone. I'm just calling your attention that there is another similar form, and Bicol is not part of this axis, obviously, but that's a potential problem. But still, the word for read, which is so commonly basa, it's having been replaced in this axis, astounds me. Okay, and then we get to the Bashic Ilocano axis. Now, this I took up in my review of Dr. Bluss' Resurrection of Proto-Philippine paper back in 2019. My review was dated 2020. He had proposed that these forms were Proto-Philippine, and I disagreed because they were primarily limited, as you can see on the map, to Ilocano and the Bashic or Batanic languages. These reconstructions were all made by Dr. Blust, but I have revised them. For example, all vowel initial forms now have glottal stop. So the first one is a plant species, Glochidion, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is Anam. We have Yami and Ilocano. Ilocano is Anam on the second syllable, but we're not sure of where the accent was because it'd be nice to have other evidence besides that. So this form, and then Bagyat. Now this is an interesting one where I made a very, what I consider an important uh, uh, footnote. Dr. Blust reconstructs it as Bagiat, following the two dictionary definitions spelling. But in thanks to Dr. Carl Rubino, he told me that the pronunciation of Ilocano is Bagyat, with as if it were a Y sound. So it's spelled the Spanish by a Spanish orthography system adapted for Ilocano spelling. However, it's a Y, would be a Y in the Philippine system. So this, since each word comes from a dictionary, the dictionary has its own orthography, and the orthography may not at all reflect the phonology. So this is a big footnote to the danger of using a dictionary sometimes because the orthography may not give you a phonemic representation. At any rate, I reconstruct this word as Bagyat because it probably was Bagyat. Another word that suffers from that is the very common word Baguio, which everybody knows is capital B, pardon, not capital, is B-A capital R, I-U capital S. All right, Bagiush for Proto-Austronesian, but generally comes out as Bagyo with two, it's bisyllabic in most Philippine languages, not trisyllabic. So that's the reason when you get that many vowels in sequence, you'd think it was a trisyllabic form, but instead it's disyllabic. Okay, we're now on smudge, dirty spot, dulit. Okay, in Ilocano, it's the dulit is the remains of a crushed bud. Yami imorod, apparently, uh, I don't know what it means for sure. In Ivatan, it's grime or dirt, like body dirt, I guess. Whereas in Itbayatan, it's rubbish, dirt, stain, or skin dirt, which is body dirt. So at any rate, it's some kind of dirty spot. But still located only so far in the Bashic and Ilocano axis area. Duyug, this one is very solid because it has the capital R at the end. You get Y in the Bashic languages, but G, that's the stereotype Philippine G, in Ilocano. But because it has this difference, it has to be a solid etymology. But so far, the forms have not appeared anywhere outside of the Philippines. In a footnote to this paper, I mentioned that there are 2 or 3 words that came from the original Bashic Ilocano axis, but now have risen to Proto-Philippine. I forgot what they are, but they're in that footnote, so please do take note of that. The next word is a sea fish, the rudder fish, which is helic. Helic, that's thanks to Itbayatan, we know it had an initial H, which is lost, but Yami has a cognate, and Ilocano has a cognate. So, but it's not found outside of this area yet, so I suspect it's part of this axis. Okay, on now to the cap R to Y axis, what I once called the North Extension. In my paper on Mangyan languages back in 1974, I proposed that North Mangyan might be related to the Central Luzon, that's the Kapampangan, Sambal, and Aita languages, might be related to Batanik and Bashiek, and I called this the North Extension at that time. Uh, I have not given up on that. At any rate, the map shows this North Extension, uh, and it's interesting because it seems to be showing a Y language group prevalent on the west side of the Philippines, going all the way from the Bashiek area, Bashi Channel, all the way through to Palawan. Okay, so the first form is bulkas, meaning morning or tomorrow. Tagalog speakers will be related with the word bukas, which comes from this, but by metathesis and then not metathesis, by loss of the L with compensatory lengthening. But Botolan has bayom buka, Sambal and Bolinao have buklas with metathesis. Ivatan has bukas, but in the meaning morning. Botolan has nubuka, and Kapampangan has bukas, meaning tomorrow, and that's what Tagalog borrowed. But the form is bulkas, and it's only in these languages, so Sambalic, Bashiek, and Kapampangan. The word in Tagalog, buto, or buto in southern Tagalog, but buto in Manila Tagalog, the word for seed, and bone, bone, is actually from this R to Y axis also. It replaces the words for bone I have there on the screen. It's in Bolinao, Iraya, and Hananoon, Butul, in Buhid, Butol, in Alangan, Bitol, with a vowel change in the first syllable, and in Botolan, Butu. And that's also Southern Tagalog. It's also in Itbayatun, Vutuh, and Ivatan, Vutuh, but there it means kernel pimple. And I mentioned already about the Tagalog loanword. Another important one is that Dr. Blust, in that paper I referenced, Resurrection of Proto-Philippine, proposed Dakil, D-A-K schwa L, which is at the end of this chain of replacements there. Proto-Austronesian Raya, Proto-Malayo-Polynesian Laba, and Proto-Philippine Dakil. Dr. Blust proposed Dakil as a Proto-Philippine innovation. I don't dispute that, but he had included the Itbayatan and Ivatan forms, but they do not have the proper reflexes for schwa. Instead, they have the reflexes for a U, and this is shared with all of the members of the axis. You've got the Bashiek with Rakug in Itbayatan, Raku in Ivatan, Iraya is Lakul, and Kapampangan is Maragul, big, and Dagul, to grow. So it's phonologically distinct from Dakil because it has, for sure, a U rather than a schwa, and Kapampangan may show that it had a G instead of a K. Now, there are a lot of words like gatil and katil for itchy. You get kati, kati in Tagalog from katil, and gatil. There's so many doublets where the K and G alternate that it is difficult to distinguish them. So generally, if every Philippine language has a K, I reconstruct a K. But if any Philippine languages have a G, I will either reconstruct a G form for everybody or a doublet with either a K and a G. So that just explains why I've chosen the G here, but it could have been a K also. All right, the next word is the word for cold. We've had a previous axis form But in this case, we have Dimla in this R to Y axis. You have the Mangyan, North Mangyan languages, Alangan Iraya with Madimla and Kapapangan with Marimla. Now, Kapapangan lost the glottal stop, but otherwise it's a good cognate. And then here again, we have the next one, Lakai, man or male. We have Proto-Austronesian Guanai and Proto-Malayo-Polynesian Laki and Proto-Western Lalaki, but this one differs. It's got a I instead of an I, AY versus an I, and it's in Beatan it's Malakai, in Ivatan it's Mahakai for male, in Botolan it's Lakai, meaning husband. So that would be there. All right, now the other part of this axis are languages that show this phenomenon, but in which R does not normally go to Y. So you have South Mangyan languages where R should come out as a G, and Kalamianic languages where the capital R should come out as an L. So this may have been a prestige language once upon a time because it was borrowed, as we will see in a number of forms. For example, next slide is Kalamian, Karamian, and Batak Ikoy for tail. This comes from Pan Ikug, which is very widespread in the Philippines with proper reflexes of G, L, or R for the capital R. But the fact that these three languages have a Y at the end can only be because they borrowed from a Y language. And which language was it? Well, we don't know, but one of the R to Y languages. So that's why I call this an axis. The next word, agutainon, has ki-yui for egg. This clearly comes from itlug, the word that itlog comes from, but this is ki-yui, which is the word for egg. It has a Y, and in fact, the Y has also the L has assimilated to the Y here. So you get a double whammy with two Ys, but this is just not a agutainon normal reflex of the word for egg. Agutainon again has nioi for coconut. Again, this is not the way that it should be. It should be niul if it were a true agutainon word. So they've borrowed it. The word in Batak and Aborlan Tagbanwa is punyangan for parent-in-law. This comes from a tuzang, the Proto-Malayo-Polynesian word for an in-law. And again, you get this capital R to Y. So you get a pun and then a R from Y. And then the word for nest is puyad in Kalamianic, all the Kalamianic languages. We can definitely reconstruct a pugad for the word for nest with a capital R. So again, this is a borrowing from a capital R to Y language. Conclusion. Do any of you have experiences that would seem to either justify or refute the axes proposed? I'm not standing dogmatic on any of these. In the paper, you'll see that I mentioned in my conclusions that I revised a lot. There's a whole axis I threw out because I realized it was just a lone situation, not an axis. There were some words I threw out because they just did not really line up properly. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's things we must distinguish are etymon, a macro group, and a selective innovation. We've got to rule each of these out, and I may have missed some. So if you find anything that is unorthodox in what I've said, please do let me know, because I'm willing to adjust anything. Because to me, it's not what I say, but what the truth is that matters. Okay, how would you define an axis? I tried my best with the definition I gave. Any unique form not found anywhere else, therefore an innovation, which spreads across two or more well-established subgroups. If anyone can give me a better definition, it will appear in the final published version of this paper. I thank you. Okay, do you have any experiences that would seem to justify? Oh, that's a repeat. Do you have suggestions for any additional axis phenomena in the Philippines? Again, I did 15. I had hoped to have 16. I threw one out, but there may be more, and you, the audience, may know of them because of your research in specific groups or areas of the Philippines that I've missed. So, at any rate, I would very much like to see. And we now turn over to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Zorc, Lolo David. Um, just a reminder to our audience, for those of you who have pre-registered for this conference, you were supposed to receive a copy of the paper. And so, as it was said a few moments ago, Dr. Zorc looks forward to all of your suggestions and further comments on the draft. So, let me read the first question, which comes to us from Leonard Henove from
Mm-hmm.
YouTube. Can we also consider Pangasinan as part of the axis in the northern Luzon? I believe there are some words that can be included from the axis. That's from Leonard Henove.
Yeah, Pangasinan is in one of the axes for sure. I remember that. I can't remember how many it was in. But yes, any language in the Philippines can be part of an axis. All it means is that whatever subgroup that language is has a word that is also found strongly in another subgroup. So yeah, Pangasinan is part of the South Cordilleran. No, is it South? Yes, South Cordilleran, isn't it? South, either Southern Luzon or South Cordilleran subgroup, along with Ibaloy, Carao, um, what is it, whatever. But yeah, it's part of a subgroup, and any two subgroups that show something, that is unusual could be an axis.
Okay. We now have a question from. Thank you so much for that answer,
Mm-hmm.
Lolo David.
Mm-hmm.
We now have a question from Cristina Gallego.
Mm-hmm.
How do you treat the data proposed by BLUS 2019 to support Proto-Philippine? Do you think the patterns in the data he presented are actually indicative of a linkage or axis rather than a single Philippine subgroup?
No, I accept almost everything he said. That's why, yeah, I don't know if you've. It's already been, my review of it has been published in the most recent Oceanic Linguistics, but you may not have access to that. I accept all of his things. The only thing, too, I disagreed with was the his a lot of inclusions from Kasiguran Dumagat or Kasiguran Agta. I think that language has been heavily influenced by Tagalog and Bicol, so not all of the forms that he cited may be Proto-Philippine. I find that a very weak, or what I call a witness, rather than a test or criterion language for Proto-Philippine. And then the axis forms that I call Bashiok or Bashiak Ilocano. Otherwise, I fully agree with what he said. I did mention also in my review a number of etymologies that he had that I disputed, but I'm sure that at least 800 of his etymologies are solid and will stand the test of time.
Okay. Now I'd like to move on to a question from Elmer Brabante from YouTube. I'm from Rinconada and am more amazed now to learn how different Bui language is. Bui or Buitnan
Mm-hmm.
language is from the other languages in Rinconada. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder what caused or what the reasons are for this distinctness or this distinctiveness.
Moving away from each other. You don't need to move across a mountain or migrate to 300 kilometers away. If you're just across a river or just move 10 kilometers away, you will, you may keep in touch, but each dialect or lect will evolve on its own terms over time. And that's why in Bicol, if you have access to Dr. McFarland's dissertation, The Dialects of the Bicol Area, he distinguished, I think, 5 what he called inland Bicol dialects. Buhinon and Rinconada are among them. Uh, uh, that there are gross differences already. Yes, each of those is a language unto itself, and the reason for it is they separated from each other and each went its own way.
Okay. Now we have this batch of comments and a question from Alex from YouTube. In reference to linkages, languages A and B might have several shared innovations, B and C several other innovations, C and D yet more innovations, and so on. Is there anything like this, where Philippine languages may be united with a group of overlapping innovations?
Oh
For
yes,
example,
this
yeah,
was the paper of Dr. Bluss. He had something like over 1,300 innovations that united the Philippines, and that's why there's still a big debate that not all linguists are convinced that there was a Proto-Philippine. However, Dr. Blust and I and Jason Lobel happen to agree with Dr. Bluss that this does constitute good evidence for a Proto-Philippine. What bothers most linguists is that the innovations are not phonological. Except I did find in my review there is one phonological innovation that does define Proto-Philippine, and that's accent. The difference between accent pairs or accented forms. For example, Proto-Austronesian macha. All right, it's mata. Originally in Malay, it's mata, accent on the first syllable. But in all Philippine languages that preserve accent patterns, it's mata. The word for tongue, though, is Proto-Austronesian dila. Okay, it accent on the first syllable just because that's where accent fell on all vowels except schwa. However, in the Philippines, it's dila. It's got a long vowel. It's accented on the first syllable. These differences actually established the Philippines as unique, as different from all other Austronesian languages. The only carryover outside of the Philippines is into Toba Batak, where the difference between things like tapus, where you have a root accent and then a stative accent. Toba Batak has that too. But apart from that pattern, there's nothing else that links any Austronesian language with the Philippine languages in terms of accent. So to me, excuse me, accent differences are a major phonological innovation for the Philippines.
yes,
And
and
then thousands of vocabulary or
yeah,
hundreds of vocabulary items. Like I mentioned this dakel. All right. Dr. Blust is right. Most Philippine languages have the Tagalog malaki that comes from this dakel. The D went to L in Tagalog, the schwa went to I, and the final L was lost. So malaki is a perfect Tagalog cognate of this Proto-Philippine dakel. Um, at any rate, that is one of over 700 solid cases of etymologies that work to unite all Philippine languages with each other.
yes, and Alex adds, it seems that a great potential from this might be whether or not these axes can be shown to have this sort of linkage relationship.
No, that's
And
right.
oh,
I'm sorry.
yes, and he also says, yes, but specifically in reference to a possible greater relationship between proposed axes.
Oh, now that I've not gotten into yet. I've not even considered if an axis is related to another axis. That certainly is done in historical linguistics with etymologies. You can raise an etymology, from Proto-Malayo-Polynesian to Proto-Austronesian because you've discovered a Formosan cognate. Uh, but whether or not these axes are joined in the same way. I doubt it, but I certainly cannot give a definitive answer to that. But I know that some scholars, like, well, I won't name names, uh, uh, do prefer to think that the whole Philippine situation was actually just an axis relationship. That, after 3,000 years of living together, more or less on the same island area, that all this common vocabulary was just one huge axis or a number of axes just evolving. But to me, the subgrouping is so consistent in so many areas that that's really solid. As I said in my paper itself, that out of my 7,000 plus forms in my Zorc data sheets, which are available on 300 that are axis forms. That's less than, well, 5% or less. And that's a decent figure. I can see that 5% of the forms are axis, and all the rest are one or another subgroup, whether it be Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, Proto-Philippine, Proto-Southern Philippine, Proto-Central Philippine, Proto-Central Cordilleran, whatever. But all the others are parts of very well-established subgroups.
Okay. Now we have two questions from Mr. Ruchi Pototanon, and I'm sure he would have wanted to ask these personally. The first one is there a possibility that pre-Austronesian languages could have served as substrates to
Oh,
create these axes?
yeah.
And the second one is there a way to order the phonological changes to make sense of the axes, or borrowing had made it close to impossible?
The first one, definitely. We don't know what the pre-Proto-Austronesian vocabulary of the various Negrita groups were. Dr. Reed wrote a paper trying, to guess at some of them. But yeah, a lot of these could be Negrito terms that extended were borrowed by the incoming Austronesians. So that one. But I'm not particularly good. Blust says I'm a data person, not a theory person, and he's absolutely right. I can't really answer it, about ordering phonological changes. That's a bit over my head, but any competent phonologist could certainly give it a try. I just want to be honest. I'm not going to try and guess some kind of answer, but I assume this kind of ordering of phonological changes, I've seen it done, can be done.
Okay. Now we have a question from Michael Lavadia. It is already a well established fact that one of the factors for linguistic variation is geography. Why is subgrouping necessary, and what specific domains of languages should be taken into account when they are subgrouped to qualify for this proposal? Do axis relationships only concern the phonological aspects of languages?
Oh, no, not at all. That's why most of the axis relationships concern vocabulary. The only phonological one is the shift of R to Y, but all the others definitely are based on lexicon, not on phonology. Um, did I miss part of a question there?
I think you were able to
Oh,
cover
why is
everything.
subgrouping? Well, subgrouping is
Yeah.
necessary. It's just part of historical linguistics. We subgroup, because they're there.
Okay. Now let's go to Philip Rentilio's question.
Mhm.
Do you think this purported prestige variety that triggered the capital R to Y shift could have been related to the hypothesized leveling that brought Greater Central Philippines, or are the time depths different?
I don't know, but that's one of the possibilities. Is this language Y, as I call it, uh, you know, itself became extinct, but left its residue on the Palawanic languages, or like Aklanum that says tubi when it should really be too big. Why do they have that glottal stop? Well, that's a North Visayan axis phenomenon. For whatever reason, I think what it was is that the form was to be, the I, it became IY, but the North Bisayans interpreted it as I glottal stop for some reason. So they wound up replacing what should be a G as a glottal stop. And my best explanation is that it's from a capital R to Y language. So yeah, it probably had prestige. It may have gone extinct. We don't know. If it's extinct, it's gone, and there's no way to know about it. But the time depths, I'm assuming that these time depths are no less than 500 years and up to 1,000. But I can't, there's no radiocarbon dating on these.
Yes. Okay, let's have a question from Jaco Lastiere. I would like to know your motivations or grounds for labeling the axes. It was mentioned that we don't know where those languages were located at the time or their original geographic locations. Then, why did you choose to group them using their geographic location? And will it be practical to label these axes using their phonological nuances?
Oh, the maps came very much later. It was suggested to me that I include maps for all these axes. I had not done so originally. But the maps are an outflow from the axes themselves. So I looked at, the map. I looked at what languages were involved and what were the group memberships of those languages, and then determined the various groups that were within each axis. But again, I have to repeat that phonology is a minimal part of this. Only the capital R to Y axis is phonologically based. All the others are lexically based. So it's not. At any rate, I did not group. I grouped them by what vocabulary they shared in common, and then I put that vocabulary through a test. Is this a selective innovation? Is this an etymology? Is this a macro group? And only if I got no for all three of those did I say, okay, this is an axis. Now, I may have been wrong. I'm willing to admit that. But I did try to test each of them. Plus, I introduced, in many cases, I could not in all, what was the Proto-Austronesian or Proto-Malayo-Indonesian form that these replaced? That became an important goal for me.
Now we're on the topic of higher nodes of Austronesian. I'd like to sneak in one of my own questions.
Sure, please.
Uh, you were in several areas of the paper. You cited reconstructions at the level of Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian. I wonder what you have to say about the recent, what, could I say, controversy, or
Oh, yes,
rather the
correct. Yeah,
trouble surrounding Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian.
right. That's a highly disputed axis, and it needs definite doctoring. Alex Smith wrote a very good and solid paper on it, showing that there were something like 16, major members of what is called Proto-Western Malayo-Polynesian, and it's a lousy catch term. It starts from way back when Dr. Dayan, or Professor Dayan, did his lexico-statistical classification, and he called something, the Proto-Hesperonesian linkage. Well, Hesperonesian was Western Austronesian, except for him it included Formosa. For me and others, I wanted Formosa to be separate. So to me, Hesperonesian was everything none, the opposite of Oceanic. But while Oceanic is well defended, Western Austronesian or Hesperonesian is not. It's horribly complex, and no, it's not sewn up. Even Dr. Blust accepts this.
Right.
So it's a crutch now more than a catch term.
I see. We have
Well,
more of a comment.
yeah. Well, it's just the opposite of oceanic, which is well established. So maybe non-oceanic.
All the non-oceanic languages.
Yeah, right.
Okay. We now have a comment from Ali Khan from Facebook, and this is kind of related to some of the other comments that have been coming in. Ali Khan says, I am looking forward to see an uh,
Mm,
updated word list for students and linguists to use in language studies.
mhm,
It is really interesting to study these axes and revalidate the lexicons. And one of the comments also asked about your data sheets and your
mm,
word lists.
uh-huh.
Where can we access them?
Oh, they're on, let's see, Zorc.net. Do you have any? Maybe you can put this up on the thing. Uh, let's see. Let me just get this. I'm sorry to do this. Uh, okay, what it is it's www, the usual www.https// then it's Zorc, ZORC.net, right slash, and then R, capital D, capital Z, ORC. So www.zorc.net/rdzorc uh, slash, and that will take you to my individual website, and within that are tons and not tons, but about 40 folders that I've put up things. But the main one that I want people to access is the publications subdirectory, because that has all my articles, and but also what you want is the folder called Philippine Etema. I've reposted that. I had it up originally with my data sheets, but you see, when I was doing my data sheets, I was doing what I would call guesstimates of what the subgrouping was. So very often I'd write just in NPH, Northern Philippine. But now, when I'm sure it's Proto Northern Philippine, I write PNP. I made so many revisions that about a month ago, I reposted all of the Access stuff. It's there with a zip file, so anyone can download it to their own computer rather than have to keep coming back to the site. And also, you need to download the list of abbreviations and the introduction text file, just so you're familiar with how it's structured. But yeah, I will keep reposting these Zorc data sheets. What they are is, way back in '72, I created 6 different templates. One that covered mainly my Visayan languages, then one that covered the entire Philippines. Another template was just the northern Philippines. Then there was a blank template for when I discovered things that didn't fit anything else, and so on. So I have several templates there, but they're all filled in. So a blank spot doesn't necessarily mean the language didn't have the word, but it definitely means I looked for it and couldn't find it. So blanks are sort of important there, because as far as I can tell, the word doesn't exist in whatever language that spot was allotted to. Any rate, it's open to everybody.
Yes, and we have just linked the website in the comment section of
Oh, you
Facebook
did.
and YouTube,
Okay. Okay. Oh,
so
there
they
it is. I
can
see it. Yes.
yes they
Zorc.net.
can access everything there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Philippine Edema. That's it. Mm-hmm. There. Oh,
Okay,
April added that. Thank you, Apes. Mm-hmm.
okay, let me just go back to one of the questions of Ali Khan again.
Mm-hmm.
How about axes on the islands of Basilan, Sulu, and
Yes.
Tawi-Tawi in Mindanao?
Yeah. Now that is an important one that I do not necessarily have data of. For my Zorc data sheets, I did Tausug, but I didn't do Sama. Or any of the Sama languages, in certainly not in any great detail. But I am well aware of that Tausug has borrowed from Sama. Sama has borrowed from Tausug. It's perfect for, yeah, Tawi Tawi area, Holo are perfect areas for access. It's an island, and I'm sure there's access, but I have never researched it. So there's an access in the waiting for sure. I'm sure there'll be something there. It's just that I've never got a sufficient amount of data that I've collated. Yeah, it's pure ignorance on my part.
Okay. Um, we're down to our last two questions,
Mm-hmm.
Lolo David.
Mm-hmm.
The first one comes from Cristina Gallego again. Do
Oh,
you
good.
think do you think trees are a good representation of linguistic relationships? This is an interesting one.
Yeah.
How realistic is it to propose a single tree for a group of languages given that there may be different ways languages develop and change?
Yes, I'm so glad. By the way, I must thank publicly Doctors Blust, Reed, Lobel, Liao, Zobel. They're listed in the first footnote of my paper. They really help. But Dr. Blust, who has been teaching historical linguistics classes for over 40 years, reminded me there's the tree model and the wave model. And the tree model works for some languages that have nice, neat descendancies. But the wave model is the only possibility of, for those that really don't agree, where it's been, cut off, followed by cut off, followed by cut off. It's not really a tree at all. He says that he asks his students at the end of the course, which is correct, the tree model or the wave model. And he said he's pleased and surprised that all the students answer both, because it really depends on the relationship of the languages you're comparing. Luckily, Aklanon and Kinaray fit nicely in a tree. But there are languages, let's say Tausug and Sama. How are you going to show that in a tree? They're different nodes. Sama comes from Borneo, and Tausug comes from Butuan. Tausugs do not like to be called Bisayan. They are genetically, but they certainly, to them, Bisaya is a slave.
Oh,
And
right, right.
because they raided the Bisayas for slaves historically. So, their connections to Butuan are super distant, at least 700 years ago, if not longer. So, the Tausug Sama axis is undiscovered yet, but probably exists. But that would be, maybe a wave and maybe nothing, because, as I said, this is just a borrowing relationship. But that's just it. We also need to make sure, amongst the things we exclude, is it, if it's a borrowing, is the borrowing itself an axis? I would maintain a borrowing can be an axis, so long as those same languages are shared over a long period of time. But you have to be careful, because some borrowings are sporadic. Um, if I remember correctly, yeah, there's a word for trousers in one symbolic language, something like botiga. I can't remember the word, but the thing is botarga. It comes from Spanish, but no other Philippine language has that Spanish loan. So that's a Spanish loan, but it's unique, as far as I know, to symbolic languages. So that Spanish has directly influenced a lot of independent or individual Philippine languages. It's not all because Cebuano or Tagalog loanwords from Spanish spread through the Philippines. Different groups borrowed directly from Spanish.
Right. We are having a really vibrant discussion in the comment section.
Mm.
Everyone, please do not worry. Uh, we will of course open and send the questions and comments that you may have, further comments and questions you may have, to Dr. Zorc. And since I am moderating this session, I'd like to take the final question. And perhaps I'm asking this more on behalf of our linguistic students who are tuned in this evening in the Philippines.
Mm.
And I noticed that you were pronouncing the reconstructions in
Mm.
your presentation, Lolo David. I'm curious,
Mispronouncing.
mispronouncing. I was wondering if you lay more on the formalist or the realist side of the spectrum of historical linguists when it comes to treating reconstructions.
Well, because the Philippine languages are so consistent phonologically, I tend to agree with was it realistic you called it? I
Yes,
believe
realist.
most there's very few formulaic reconstructions in Austronesian compared to, let's say, Indo European, which are phenomenally formulaic. I mean, I can't decipher half of them. But Austronesian reconstructions are pretty straightforward, mostly. Um, there's one, for example, I wish I could spell, Dr. Blust reconstructs, see, it's Hamuti. That's right. He reconstructed as capital S, U, M, schwa, capital C, I think. Uh, and but I reconstructed instead of a schwa with a short U. And I have suddenly become formulaic, and that's because okay, Pai1, which is the only Formosan language that has all three syllables aligned with the etymology, has a schwa. But you get muti in several Philippine languages for this particular shrub, and hamti in some other Philippine languages. So the point is, it's being muti in some Philippine languages. There's got to be a u in that word, I think. But if there's a u there, it has to be short because it went to schwa in Paiwan. Uh, Dr. Bluss doesn't agree with me. He sticks with his schwa reconstruction, and I stick with my short u for that. But whatever it is, one of them would be I would call formulaic, and that's the one that I do. And I only have I can't remember them all, but about 5 what I would call formulas because they don't really agree with the evidence. But vast majority of Austronesian and Philippine reconstructions look pretty much like at least some of the daughter languages.
Yes, thank you so much. And to all our audience members still tuned in, thank you so much for all your questions and feedback. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that Dr. Zorc is certainly looking forward to your comments on his manuscript, on his paper. At this juncture, I would like to call on Assistant Professor Jem R. Javier, the chairperson of the UP Department of Linguistics, to award the certificate for being the plenary speaker.
Okay. Thank you, Vinci, for expertly moderating tonight's session. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first day of the 14th Philippine Linguistics Congress. At this point, let me read the citation for Dr. Zorc. University of the Philippines, Diliman, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, Department of Linguistics. This humble certificate of appreciation is hereby awarded to R. David Zorc for delivering the plenary lecture titled Axis Relationships in the Philippines When Traditional Subgrouping Falls Short during the 14th Philippine Linguistics Congress organized by the UP Department of Linguistics, given this 24th day of August 2021, signed by yours truly. On behalf of the UP Department of Linguistics, I would like to give our wholehearted thanks to Dr. Zorc for gracing the event by sharing with us his important work in Philippine linguistics. Despite the anthropos that we are experiencing, you managed to tag us along your linguistic journey throughout the different parts of the Philippines and solidifying the close relationships among languages and even ethnic groups in the country through your plenary lecture. We are thrilled also to announce that his paper will be published in the Archive Journal and will be made available to the public in a month or two. Special shout out also to Miss April Almarines, who serves as Dr. Zorc's copy editor and slide presentation operator. Since last year, our department has been in constant communication with Dr. Zorc because originally the 14 PLC was to be held in October 2020. Unfortunately, like Tokyo 2020, because of the pandemic, we had to postpone the conference and conduct it virtually. Recognizing the importance of sharing some updates on his work on Philippine diachronic and comparative linguistics, Dr. Zorc so graciously adapted to the times, learned the techies and navigating the cyberspace, and did everything to be with us today.
Mhm.
More power in your research, Dr. Zorc. I know that you're aware that you really are an institution in Philippine and Austronesian linguistics, and we will wait for more research outputs that you will produce that will inspire us to begin and or carry on with our own research projects in Philippine linguistics and languages.
Mhm.
Stay safe and healthy with your colleagues and loved ones, Dr. Zorc. We will meet soon when the pandemic is over. Thank you, everyone, and see you in the succeeding days of 14 PLC.
Goodbye, and thank you so
Yes.
much for participating.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zork.
Mhm.